Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a very close look at one of the darkest chapters in human history. But, we aren't just going to sit here and recite dates and battles. Instead, we're really going to dig into the actual sobering mechanics of how an atrocity of this sheer scale actually happens, based on the historical course material. How exactly does a dangerous ideology mix with everyday bureaucracy and then combine with the total chaos of war to create unimaginable tragedy? By breaking down these historical mechanics, we gain a pretty crucial perspective on the fragile structures of our own society. A lot of times, we look back at monumental historical events and just assume, well, they were inevitable, right? But as you'll see, examining the step-by-step evolution of genocide reveals how a cascade of very specific, terrible choices led directly to the Holocaust.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp how this all happened, we're going to follow a chronological roadmap. First up, we'll debunk the myth of a single master plan. Next, we'll look at the subhuman ideology, followed by the deadly precursor known as the T4 program. Then we'll hit 1939 with the war in the ghettos, move into the 1941 Holocaust by bullets, and finally, look at how the war itself acted as the ultimate catalyst.
Section 1. Not a single plan. Shattering the myth. We really need to understand that this didn't just appear overnight as some fully formed master plan.
So did the Holocaust actually begin with a single plan? When we look back at historical atrocities of this magnitude, our brains naturally try to make sense of it all. We kind of picture a single group of people sitting around in a smoky room, drawing up a complete evil blueprint from day one. Honestly, it's almost a comforting thought in a really dark way, because it implies that evil is super organized, easily recognizable, and completely distinct from normal everyday bureaucracy. But we have to ask ourselves that question. It's a huge misconception that it just appeared suddenly. The historical material actually shows us that the reality is much more complex, much more gradual, and frankly, a whole lot more unsettling.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows the genocide actually evolved. It wasn't one single blueprint. It was more like this terrifying bureaucratic feedback loop. Orders coming down from the top of the Nazi leadership were frequently, and probably intentionally, super vague. They absolutely didn't issue crystal-clear directives detailing exactly how to carry out mass murder right from the start. And this ambiguity? Well, it left a massive amount of room for mid-level officials and local authorities to interpret those directives. And instead of holding back, these individuals often tried to prove their loyalty and their efficiency by interpreting those vague orders in increasingly radical, aggressive ways. So the atrocity was really constructed piece by piece through this decentralized interpretation. It created a twisted system where local radicalization actually drove the national policy forward.
Section 2. The subhuman ideology, the racist foundation. Let's look at the foundational ideas that justified all of this evolving persecution.
You see, before policies of persecution can escalate into systematic murder, there literally has to be a foundational ideology that justifies it to the people pulling the levers. The bureaucracy of genocide desperately needs an ideological engine. And central to this was the concept of the Untermensch, which is a racist Nazi concept translating directly to subhuman. By assigning this very clinical, pseudo-scientific label to entire demographics, the ideology actively stripped away their humanity in the eyes of the perpetrators. It literally turned neighbors and citizens into abstract problems that just needed to be solved. This specific, horrific belief system was the absolute prerequisite for everything else. It made systematic violence not just acceptable, but legally and socially rationalized by the very people carrying it out.
And the application of this ideology cast a devastatingly wide net. The targeted populations included Jews, the Roma, people with physical and mental disabilities, and several other minority groups that got caught in the crosshairs of Nazi racial policies. By lumping all these diverse, vibrant communities under one single dehumanizing label, the state essentially created a psychological framework that made the unthinkable entirely possible. At that point, it just didn't matter what these individuals believed, what they did for a living, or how they contributed to their communities. The ideology completely flattened all of that human complexity into a single, deadly category, which laid the grim groundwork for everything that was to follow.
Section 3. T4, the deadly precursor, the early campaign. Now, moving chronologically, let's see how these ideas moved into early implementation.
We can really see how this racist ideology moved from theory into deadly practice way before the massive extermination camps were even built. The very first major implementation was the T4 euthanasia program. This was a systematic campaign aimed at murdering people with physical and mental disabilities. And historically speaking, this is an absolutely critical marker because it functioned as a testing ground, Literally, a rehearsal. It was right here that the regime first developed the bureaucratic systems, the highly deceptive language they used to hide their actions from the general public, and the actual physical methods of systematic killing. The personnel who operated this T4 program gained gruesome hands-on experience that would later be adapted, refined, and scaled up for the wider Holocaust.
Section 4, 1939, War and Ghettos, the Expansion of Persecution. Let's move to and see how this builds with the outbreak of the Second World War.
When the dynamic of a massive global military conflict is introduced, the escalation compounds incredibly fast. Thinking about the timeline, in 1939, the invasion of Poland officially sparks World War II. Then, over the next 2 years, from 1939 to 1941, we see the creation of forced ghettos, which leads right up to the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. The outward military expansion of the war created entirely new, extremely chaotic conditions, and under the cover of all that fog and chaos, increasingly radical policies really started to take hold. The normal rules of society are completely suspended during wartime, and the regime absolutely used this massive disruption as a smokescreen to accelerate their racial agendas without having to worry about international or even domestic pushback.
If you look really closely at the 1939 invasion of Poland, this specific military action led directly to the forced concentration and isolation of Jews into ghettos. But here is the really crucial mechanic to understand. As the war expanded, it wasn't always just some top-down mandate driving the severity. Decisions made by local, mid-level officials right there on the ground continually intensified these anti-Jewish measures. Faced with the crazy logistical challenges of occupying a brand new territory and managing hundreds of thousands of newly subjugated people, local administrators basically took it upon themselves to initiate more and more extreme methods of control. The veil of a newly ignited world war completely amplified that snowball effect of decentralized choices we were talking about earlier. It pushed the entire system closer and closer to the brink of total annihilation.
Section 5, 1941, Holocaust by Bullets, a major turning point. This is where the momentum shifts into an even darker, more violent gear. As the military campaigns pushed further and further east, the sheer nature of the persecution underwent a dramatic, violent escalation. The historical course material explicitly refers to the events of 1941, specifically the invasion of the Soviet Union, as, quote, a major turning point in the Holocaust. We see a totally terrifying transition right here. The regime aggressively shifted from policies of forced isolation, starvation, and persecution in the ghettos to systematic, active mass execution directly out in the field. The massive scale of the war fundamentally changed the scale of the atrocities being committed. This horrific phase is historically known as the Holocaust by bullets. Following that 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the regime deployed mobile killing units, known as the Einsatzgruppen. Now, instead of sending victims away to camps, these heavily armed units literally followed right behind the advancing military front. Their specific task? Carrying out mass shootings of Jews, political commissars, and other civilians. It's a stark, deeply unsettling illustration of how the actual progression of the war actively unlocked the darkest possible phases of the genocide. It brought systematic murder right to the doorsteps of newly conquered territories, essentially normalizing mass slaughter as just another standard operating procedure of military conquest.
Section 6, War as the Catalyst, the Acceleration of Atrocity. Let's pull all these threads together to really see the big picture.
We've traced the timeline and the methods, and synthesizing them reveals a pretty horrific progression. Step 1. The T4 euthanasia program establishes the whole systemic bureaucratic approach to murder. Step 2. Forced concentration in ghettos isolates the targeted populations, all under the convenient cover of the Polish invasion. And then Step 3. The Einsatzgruppen actually brings mass execution directly into the expanding Eastern Front. And this brilliantly illustrates the step-by-step evolution of these methods. The historical consensus really emphasizes that World War II wasn't just some background noise going on at the same time. It was the absolute key catalyst that transformed deep-seated persecution into outright systematic genocide. The mechanics of war and the mechanics of genocide basically developed side by side, with each one fueling the other in this catastrophic downward spiral.
So the crucial point is that one of history's absolute greatest atrocities did not just happen overnight. It was a terrifying alchemy of racist ideology, cold bureaucracy, the fog of war, and, really importantly, decentralized individual decisions. When you combine deep-seated prejudice with vague, open-ended orders from the highest levels of government, you end up empowering individuals on the ground to interpret those orders radically. The ultimate danger of vague orders is that atrocities compound over time through thousands of local, individual choices. People just trying to please their superiors, people caught up in the wild momentum of wartime logistics, and people completely blinded by ideology, they all contributed to an evolving machine of death. Which leaves us with a profound, super necessary question to reflect upon as we wrap up. How do vague orders and the chaos of war turn prejudice into genocide? Understanding these evolutionary stages isn't just about memorizing facts from the past. It's about recognizing the vulnerabilities in our very own human institutions today. It shows us, plain as day, how a lack of clarity, unchecked prejudice, and the distracting cover of international conflict can slowly, methodically build into unimaginable horror. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.